Today's lab is not a very long lab. The reason it's not a very long lab is because we don't have a lot of identification. You'll see that the model list that we have is a fairly short model list as far as model lists are concerned in these classes. So we will go through the image gallery and I will identify these different structures and these different organs for you. And then we will talk about histology, which for the histology in today's lab, we're going to look at a pituitary gland. We're going to look at the thyroid, the parathyroid gland, the adrenal gland, and the pancreas. Now, A&P2 is set up a little different than A&P1 in that the histology is kind of spread out over the entire semester. We're not going to knock it all out in two labs like we did in A&P1 and be done with it. Instead, we're going to do the histology based on each individual system. So we'll have histology today for the endocrine system. We'll have histology for the blood vessels. We'll have histology for the blood, the digestive, the respiratory, reproductive. So each system is going to have some histology typically tied to it. So we'll talk a little bit about the physiology of the endocrine system here, kind of explain how the endocrine system is working and what hormones are and that type of thing. But a big part of today's lab is going to be the identification of hormones. Each one of these endocrine organs is going to secrete different hormones. Those hormones are going to have target tissues that they're going to affect, and those hormones are going to elicit certain responses within the body. Your job as part of this lab is going to be to learn those hormones. Now, at the end of this, and what I'm showing you right here is actually exercise 1. All right. So if you have your lab manual, this is the first exercise in the lab manual. And if you don't have it yet, this will be the first thing you will see. But every week I'll pull up a PDF of the exercise from the lab manual, and that's kind of what we will lecture off of. So on this exercise, or in this exercise, when you scroll to the very end, you're going to find 2 tables. All right. You see one table right here. All right. This is a table that tells you the hormones released from the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. It gives you their target tissue and organ and gives you the chief function of that hormone. Then this table does the same for the thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal cortex, adrenal medulla, pancreas, testes, ovary, kidneys, and heart. These hormones, okay, on both tables, these target tissues, these functions, those are things that you need to know for the physiology practical in here. You may also see questions about the hormones as follow-up questions to some of the histology questions in here. Now, I know that seems like a lot, but guess what? In your lecture class, you're going to have to know those same hormones, all right? Regardless of whether you have Miss Strickland or Mr. Russell or Dr. Worrell or whoever, you're going to be learning those hormones in the endocrine in chapter 18. So you're going to be learning in both classes. All right. So let's talk about the endocrine system. Let's talk primarily about the function of the endocrine system. What is the generalized function of the endocrine system? What does it do? What do all systems do, really? What's the answer to every question I say in my classes?
Regulating homeostasis.
Homeostasis, right? Regulating homeostasis. If you've not had me before, I joke and I say, hey, the answer to almost every question can be homeostasis, because homeostasis is what the body is all about. So the endocrine system's primary job is involved in regulating homeostasis. Now, all systems kind of regulate homeostasis in one way or another, but this system, like the nervous system, is really helping to regulate homeostasis. How is it helping to regulate homeostasis? Well, it plays an integral role in feedback systems. Remember feedback systems from A&P1. You know, we had receptors, we had control centers, and we had effectors. And we said the effectors and control centers were either going, or the effectors in feedback systems were either going to be muscles or they were going to be glands. Well, guess what the endocrine system is made up of? It's made up of a bunch of glands. So the endocrine system is going to play an important role in making changes based on feedback systems. Now, the nervous system obviously is the primary system of control in our body, but the endocrine system works very closely with the nervous system to help to control functions in the body, to help control and balance that homeostasis. Now, the nervous system obviously works by electrical impulses. Now, we learned in the nervous system that those electrical impulses are going to be related also to ligands. Okay, neurotransmitters were considered ligands. Those ligands were going to have target tissues, and those target tissues were, sometimes muscles, sometimes organs, sometimes other neurons. Well, ligands, remember, are just chemical messengers which are going to bind to receptor sites. That's what hormones are. So the endocrine system's job is to respond to information and feedback by releasing hormones. Now, hormones are going to then be released into the bloodstream. Now, how do I know that the hormones released from the endocrine system are going to be released into the bloodstream? How do I know that for a 100% fact? What's the name of the system?
Endocrine.
The endocrine system. And what does endocrine mean?
Into
Into the bloodstream.
bloodstream.
Yes, correct. Remember, exocrine is a gland that releases its secretions into an open space or a lumen, like a sweat gland or a salivary gland or a digestive gland. It's into an open space. But remember, the definition of endocrine meant into the bloodstream. So these hormones are all going to get released into the bloodstream. And what's the bloodstream going to do? It's going to circulate them. It's going to transport them. So as they transport through the circulatory system, they are going to be brought to their target tissue sites. Now, they're going to be brought to a lot of other sites, but if there's no binding receptors at a certain site, then they're not going to have any effect on that site. Now, because of the transport mechanism and being using the circulatory system, it's going to take a little bit longer for the endocrine system to work. Remember, the nervous system works by using nerve impulses, which can travel in myelinated axons up to 120 meters a second. Well, that's not going to be even remotely close or slow as the endocrine system is going to work. The endocrine system, we got to release it into the bloodstream, and then the heart has got to pump it through everywhere. But because the nervous system works based on neurotransmitters and impulses, it works quickly, but the effects are very short lasting. It's also very metabolically expensive, uses a lot of ATP for us to be able to maintain things to continue to happen. So the endocrine system gives us a way that is going to have longer lasting effects, but it's also going to be cheaper for our body based on ATP usage. So the endocrine system's slow response, but has a lingering effect because the hormones then are continuing to circulate in the body. Now, eventually, those hormones can get broken down by enzymes, and if they aren't used or we release too much, then the body obviously does away with them. But they give us the ability to be able to sustain changes to the body longer than nerve impulses and at a much lower cost from an energy standpoint than nerve impulses. Now, these hormones, even in low concentrations, are going to have very, very strong effects on cellular function. Now, there are two types of hormones that get released in the body. One is a lipid hormone, and the other is a water lipid soluble hormone, and the other is a water soluble hormone. Now, solubility means that it can be dissolved in, right? So if I say water soluble, that means that something can be dissolved in water. If I say lipid soluble, it means something can be dissolved in a lipid. Now, what do we know about water and lipids? They don't what? They don't mix, they don't interact, okay? Which is what makes membranes so effective at being a barrier, because a membrane is a bilayer of phospholipids. And so that keeps the water on the outside of the cell, and the cytoplasm on the inside. But that lipid barrier is impermeable to anything dissolved in water unless we allow it through certain channels. Well, that means that a water soluble hormone is going to basically affect things on the outside of the cell. But a lipid soluble hormone can do what? A lipid soluble hormone can pass through the cell. Why? Because it can dissolve in lipids. So if I have a lipid membrane and a lipid soluble hormone comes up to the lipid membrane, guess what the lipid soluble hormone can do? It can just pass right through the membrane. So water soluble hormones are going to affect the cell on the outside, which means oftentimes these water soluble hormones act as messengers, okay, because they are initiating a response on the surface of the cell, which then can initiate responses inside the cell, but they can't get into the cell to affect anything. But our lipid soluble hormones can get into the cell, meaning that they can bind to receptors in the cytoplasm, or even they can bind to receptors inside of the nucleus, which means that lipid soluble hormones can lead to genetic changes or have effects on genes. All right. So there's differences between the two types of hormones that are present. There's benefits to water soluble though as well, because water soluble means that they can be transported actually more easily through the body, because the blood is mostly made up of plasma, which is mostly made up of water. So that means we can dissolve these water soluble hormones and transport them just through the bloodstream, whereas lipid soluble hormones have to use a protein transporter to bind to travel through. So there's positives and negatives with both, but the main thing to remember is how they're affecting the cell. Water soluble hormones are binding to the outside of the cell and making changes by using messenger systems, whereas lipid soluble hormones have the ability to permeate into the cell and make changes in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus itself. Now, we have two different hormone sources, okay? We have what we call endocrine organs, and we have what we refer to as endocrine tissues. An endocrine organ is a dedicated gland which is specifically designed to secrete hormones, meaning that's all it does, all right? A gland that just secretes hormones would be classified as an endocrine organ, whereas endocrine tissues are hormone secreting tissues in an organ whose job is not primarily to secrete hormones. So examples of endocrine organs would be like the pituitary gland, okay, the thyroid gland. Those two glands, all they do is secrete hormones. That's it. They have no other primary function. Now, the kidneys also secrete hormones, but the kidney's primary goal or primary role is not secreting hormones. The kidney's primary role is filtration of blood. The heart is going to secrete hormones, but we know the heart's main job is not to secrete hormones. It's to pump blood. So those would be classified as endocrine tissues. All right. So if its job is just secreting hormones, it's an endocrine organ. If its job is something else, but it also secretes hormones, it would be endocrine tissues. Now we're going to go through on the model on the image gallery, and I'm going to show you on the image gallery on each one of those models, the endocrine organs and the endocrine tissues that you are responsible for identifying that are on the list in just a second. So we talked about solubility. That's one of the ways that we can classify hormones. We talked about why it's water, why they would be water soluble and what that means, and why they're lipid soluble, what that means. I always tell students, anytime you see bold type in this lab manual, those are key things that you need to make sure that you remember, all right? So you need to make sure you understand the difference between endocrine organs and endocrine tissues. You need to make sure you know the ways that hormones are classified by solubility, water hormones, lipid soluble. What does that mean for each one, all right? The chemical structure of hormones. They can either be steroids, which means that they have a sterol ring associated with them, biogenic amines and peptide hormones. Okay, these are going to be water-soluble molecules, which basically are built from amino acids, and then echinosoids. All right, so make sure you know the three or the different types of steroid category or structural categories that we find for hormones, and then target location. Where is this hormone going to be eliciting its response? If it's a circulating hormone, it's going to be eliciting its response somewhere else, because it's going to enter the blood and exert its effects later on. Whereas if it's a local hormone, it's going to be exerting its effects before it enters the bloodstream. And the local hormones are two different types. We have paracrine and we have autocrine. paracrine hormones are going to exert their effects near the secreting cell, whereas auto means self. So an autocrine hormone is going to exert its effects on the secreting cell. Now, here are our dedicated endocrine organs and our organs containing endocrine tissues. Our dedicated endocrine organs are the adrenal gland, the parathyroid, the thyroid gland, the pineal gland, and the pituitary gland. Okay, the pituitary gland is also going to be associated with the hypothalamus, but the hypothalamus is going to be endocrine tissue. Why is it considered endocrine tissue? Well, you remember the hypothalamus is in the nervous system, and the hypothalamus has a huge job associated with the autonomic nervous system, and that's its primary goal, right? Because it's part of the nervous system that secretes hormones, it's classified as endocrine tissue. Organs that contain endocrine tissue. We're gonna look at the thymus today, the heart, the kidney, the hypothalamus, the liver, the pancreas. I don't believe we have a skin model, but hopefully you would be able to recognize skin. Duodenum, stomach, testes, ovary, and we do not have a placenta model, so you can kind of scratch through that. So let's take a look at our image gallery, and I'm going to go through the image gallery, and you can go back and watch this again, so you don't have to try to furiously write this down, but I'm going to go through the image gallery and I'm going to identify all of these organs and the endocrine tissues associated with them through these different models. So this first board that we have here, this is actually a new model that we just got in, and it shows us a lot of different endocrine organs and endocrine tissues on this model. Now, the first one we see right here is the pituitary gland, all right? This is the anterior part of the pituitary gland. This is the posterior part of the pituitary gland. The anterior part is called the adenohypophysis, and the posterior part is called the neurohypophysis. Now, the pituitary gland itself can be referred to as the hypophysis. Now, this should help to kind of tie up some loose ends, all right? And I'm going to test you on A&P 1 stuff all semester. Okay, not test you on it, but I'm gonna bring it up during class time and mentally check you on A&P stuff. So if you're in my A&P class, I'm gonna expect you obviously to perform very well on these mental tests. In the skull, okay, in the cranium, the sphenoid bone on the inside view had a saddle-shaped structure in that sphenoid bone, and that saddle-shaped structure was called what? Oh, Dr. B, it's the first day of class. The sella turcica, right? The sella turcica. That sella turcica had a depression in it called the hypophyseal fossa, correct? If I can see you, just nod your head. Yes, Dr. B, that's correct. The hypophyseal fossa. Well, now that kind of makes sense, right? Because if the pituitary gland is called the hypophysis, then the fossa that it sits in would be the hypophyseal fossa. So that's where the pituitary gland is going to sit. Now, right here, okay, this butterfly-shaped bilobed gland, this is the thyroid gland. It's going to be located inferior to the larynx and wrapping itself just right around the front side of the trachea right there. This is the kidney, okay? This would be the left kidney right here, and that would be the adrenal gland sitting right on top of it. Now, the adrenal gland oftentimes is referred to the suprarenal gland because it's sitting on top of the kidney, and the kidney is part of the renal system. This is a testes, all right? So this would be endocrine tissue, just like this kidney. Remember, the kidney's primary function is not secreting hormones, but filtration, and the testes is the same way. Primary function of the testes is gamete production, but it also does secrete hormones. This is the female reproductive system, all right? We have an ovary right there. There's another ovary right here, and that's the uterus right there, okay? All part of endocrine tissues. This is the posterior of this. So what we see is the backside of our thyroid glands. And on the thyroid glands, on each lobe, we have two parathyroid glands, which is what these two little guys are on both sides. And lastly, this guy right here is the pancreas. Now, the pancreas is classified as endocrine tissue. It has both endocrine and exocrine function, and it's kind of 50-50. So it's not specifically related to endocrine function. The endocrine function it's going to be related to is going to be blood glucose levels. It releases insulin and glucagon, but it also releases digestive enzymes into the intestinal system, and that's part of its exocrine function. Okay, so these are all glands and tissues that you could be asked to identify on the exam. Here is a mid-sagittal section of our brain. So 3 things we can see on here related to endocrine function: the pituitary gland right there, the hypothalamus right here, and the pineal gland right there. Female reproductive system, okay? We have an ovary over here, and we have the uterus right here. Another mid-sagittal section of the brain, okay? This is a little bit different because we do include the skull. So you can see this sella turcica right there, which is part of the sphenoid bone. That's the sphenoid sinus right there. So there is our pituitary gland, our hypothalamus, and our pineal gland. Kidney, sitting on top of the kidney, the adrenal gland. Now, this adrenal gland has been sectioned, and when we look at the adrenal gland, we're going to see an adrenal cortex and an adrenal medulla. If you remember me talking about it in A&P1, I referenced cortex and medulla at some point in the nervous system when we talked about the cerebral cortex being on the outside of the brain and the medulla oblongata being on the inside of the brain. We also, in the skeletal system, have a medullary cavity, which is on the inside of the bone, and the bony cortex is on the outside of the bone. Every time you see the word cortex and medulla, it's always going to reference the same things. Cortex is always more superficial. Medulla is always deep. It doesn't matter if we're talking about an adrenal gland, if we're talking about the kidney, if we're talking about a lymph node, if we're talking about the brain. Cortex is always on the outside. Medulla is always on the inside. So when we look at this adrenal gland sectioned right here, the outer portion of the adrenal gland is called a capsule. But then we see the adrenal cortex, which is the yellow part right here. And we see the adrenal medulla, which is this part right here. Again, cortex is always superficial. Medulla is always deep. Male reproductive system. Okay, again, we have endocrine tissue in the form of the testes. Here is another larynx model. We can see we have a lobe right here of the thyroid gland. Here is a digestive system model, well, a little bit of everything, but this is our pancreas, all right? The pancreas has a head, which is this portion right here, and the head of the pancreas is going to be tucked into this curvature of the small intestine. This curvature of the small intestine is the beginning portion of the small intestine called the duodenum. And the duodenum has some endocrine tissues associated with it as well. So you have the duodenum and the pancreas. Now you do also back here have a kidney with an adrenal gland, and over there you do have a kidney with an adrenal gland. Here's a section of the mediastinum. You'll remember the mediastinum is the cavity between the 2 pleural cavities in the thoracic cavity. We know that primarily that is going to contain the pericardial cavity, which contains the heart right here. But then we also have this gland, which is the thymus gland, okay? Don't get your thymus and your thyroid mixed up. The thymus sits on the heart, the thyroid is in your neck. Here is our digestive system longboard. We have the stomach, which has endocrine tissues. We have the pancreas right here, which has endocrine tissues. We have the duodenum right here. Just to kind of get you some reference, okay? Here's your liver, there's your gallbladder, here's a spleen, these are all your intestines. And that takes care of the models. So again, in your pre and post lab activities, these should be the models that you see that you'll be asked to identify this list of structures on right here. So this is your study list for what you need to be able to identify on models for the practical. Any questions on that? All right, then let's go talk about the histology. The first slide that we're going to look at is going to be a pituitary gland. Again, we can call the pituitary gland the hypophysis, but if you put pituitary gland on the practical, that would be just fine. Like we said, the pituitary gland is going to sit in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. And that should kind of give you an idea that the pituitary gland is pretty important. I mean, we know that if something's important in our body, we're going to protect it with bone. And if you have this sella turcica, which is this saddle-shaped structure right here, and the pituitary gland is sitting down in it, that means that it's protected anteriorly, inferiorly, and posteriorly by bone. That means it's pretty important if we're giving it its own little area to sit and be protected by bone. And the pituitary gland is so important because it basically is the brain of the endocrine system. It is the primary gland, which is going to help to control a lot of other glandular tissue. Now, we said that the pituitary gland is divided into the adenohypophysis, which is the anterior portion, and the neurohypophysis, which is the posterior portion. When we look at the slide for the pituitary gland, you're going to notice that the two parts of the pituitary gland stain completely differently. The adenohypophysis is always going to stain much darker, all right? So that's one of the ways that you can remember. When you see the pituitary gland, you'll have two different densities of staining tissue. The darker stained is the anterior, the lighter stained is the posterior. Now, they're both going to be subjected to regulation initiated by the hypothalamus. You remember the hypothalamus, one of its jobs is to be a communication bridge between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus is going to kind of start to stimulate some of the activity associated with the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is also going to secrete hormones that the posterior pituitary gland is going to store. Now, the anterior pituitary gland is divided into three regions: the pars distalis, the pars intermedia, and the pars tubularis. Okay, the pars distalis is the largest portion, and it is responsible for making 7 different hormones. These 7 different hormones are going to be created by 5 different cell types: somatotrophs, thyrotrophs, gonadotrophs, lactotrophs, and corticotrophs. Now, those cells, okay, somatotroph, thyrotroph, gonadotroph, lactotroph, and corticotroph, they should kind of give you a clue as to what those hormones that they secrete, what parts of the body they're going to affect. Somatotroph, okay, somatic nervous system. What is the somatic nervous system responsible for controlling? It's responsible for controlling skeletal muscle. We associate skeletal muscle also with the skeletal system. So any hormone created by a somatotroph, you would expect that hormone to have some type of effect on skeletal and muscle. Thyrotroph. Well, thyrotroph probably sounds a lot like thyroid. So you would expect a thyrotroph to secrete hormones that would affect the thyroid gland. Gonadotroph, you would expect that to secrete hormones that were going to target reproductive organs. Lactotrophs, you would expect to target tissue responsible for lactation. And corticotrophs, you would expect to be responsible for cells associated maybe with the adrenal gland, okay, or with the skin. So we're going to identify the hormones that come from these 5 different types of cells as they relate to the adenohypophysis. Now, we said that the neurohypophysis is going to secrete 2, let me rephrase, is going to release 2 hormones, but it doesn't make those hormones. It doesn't synthesize them. Okay, the synthesis of those hormones is going to come from the hypothalamus. So it's going to basically gather these hormones from the hypothalamus, and then it's going to secrete them into the bloodstream. So here's our anterior pituitary gland, or our adenohypophysis, and here are the 7 hormones that it secretes. Now, somatotrophs secrete human growth hormone. Hey, we know human growth hormone from AMP1, and we know that affects muscle mass and density of bone. Thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, thyroid stimulating hormone is going to do what? It's going to stimulate the thyroid gland. Okay, that's why it's called thyroid stimulating hormone. If something has stimulating after the first name, that basically tells you that it's going to be stimulating whatever is listed before it. Now, a common mistake that students make, and so I'm telling you this so you don't make it, if I ask you to identify a hormone from the thyroid gland, what would you not put? You wouldn't put thyroid stimulating hormone because the thyroid wouldn't secrete a hormone to stimulate itself. The stimulation of the thyroid gland has to come from somewhere else. All right, so the thyroid gland is going to be activated by thyroid stimulating hormone, but it's not going to produce it. So don't get that confused. Luteinizing hormone is secreted by gonadotrophs, and follicle stimulating hormone secreted by gonadotrophs. Prolactin secreted by lactotrophs. And then we have melanocyte stimulating hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone secreted by the corticotropes. Now, I will allow abbreviations, HGH, TSH, LH, FSH, so forth. I will allow abbreviations on the anatomy test, right? But you likely won't see the abbreviations on the physiology test, okay? But if I ask you, identify this tissue and give me a hormone for the follow-up question, you can use one of the abbreviations on the anatomy test. Now, the posterior pituitary gland, again, it is lighter staining and smaller, and it's going to secrete 2 different hormones. Antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is going to affect the kidneys, and it is going to play a role in water reabsorption. And this is the hormone that is most greatly affected by things like caffeine and alcohol. Caffeine and alcohol are going to inhibit antidiuretic hormone, which is going to cause you to lose more water via urination, which is why when you drink excessive amounts of caffeine or alcohol, your urination frequency goes up. And then oxytocin is related to labor and childbirth, and oxytocin is going to affect the uterus, and it's going to increase uterine contractions related to that positive feedback system. So let's take a look at our pituitary gland. Now, all you'll be responsible for identifying on the pituitary gland is the gland itself, and then either the adeno or the neurohypophysis. So you'll have to tell me this is the pituitary gland, or if I ask you specifically, you'll have to tell me this is the anterior or posterior part. So here's our pituitary gland, all right? And like I said, the anterior or adenohypophysis stains darker. The posterior or neurohypophysis stains lighter. Here's another section, anterior, posterior. Here's a lighter, less effective sample, but this is your anterior here, and this lighter area here, your posterior. And then one more at a higher magnification, anterior, which is much darker, posterior, which is lighter. So any of those 4 slides could be slides that you would see on the practical that you'd have to identify as either anterior or posterior, or if I just ask you to identify the organ, you just tell me pituitary gland. Now, our next 2 glands, parathyroid and thyroid. Now, to me, thyroid is one of the easiest tissues to be able to identify because of the follicular arrangement of the thyroid tissues. Thyroid gland is made up of these individual spherical follicles, and a follicle is basically going to be a single row of cuboid-shaped cells that surrounds a colloid material that's located in the middle of those follicular cells. The follicular cells are going to be the hormone synthesizing cells, and the colloid is going to be a storage site for thyroglobulin, which is going to be a protein which is going to allow for the synthesis of the thyroid hormones. Now, the follicular cells are going to be responsible for secreting our T4 and T3. Okay, these are what we typically refer to as thyroid hormones, right? So when somebody has some type of thyroid deficiency or inactivity and they're on thyroid hormones, these are the hormone types that they're taking to help to balance their lack of production from the thyroid gland. Now, there are going to be clusters of cells in between the follicles that kind of fill in the spaces, and those are called parafollicular cells. Those parafollicular cells are going to secrete calcitonin. Calcitonin should ring a bell because we know it's associated with the skeletal system and regulation of blood calcium levels. All right, remember calcitonin is going to turn on osteoblastic activity and help bring down blood calcium levels. Whereas parathyroid hormone, which obviously is going to be secreted by the parathyroid gland, does the opposite and helps to raise blood calcium levels. All right, but let's take a look at the thyroid and parathyroid. Now, this slide here shows both, right? All of this over here is all thyroid tissue, and this right here is parathyroid. So if we look more closely at the thyroid tissue here, this is what the thyroid tissue looks like. Now, all the pink bubble gum that you kind of see in the middle of these circles, that pink bubble gum, that's the colloid material, right? So that's the thyroglobulin that's producing the proteins. The single row of cells that exists on the outside of that colloid, those would be the follicular cells, all right? So let me zoom in on this a little bit, make it a little bit easier. So right here, right, we have colloid, and I have a single row of cells right here around that colloid that are the follicular cells. Now, the follicular cells plus the colloid equals a follicle. So from right here to right here would be one follicle. From right here to right here would be one follicle. Follicular cells secrete T3 and T4. Then in between these follicles, we have these clusters of cells. Those would be the parafollicular cells. And the parafollicular cells are what secrete calcitonin. All right. So again, parafollicular, they are not associated with the colloid. The follicular cells are associated with the colloid, and they are part of our follicle. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. Silence means yes. Again, colloid material, colloid material, colloid, cells associated with it, follicular cells plus colloid equals follicle. Right here, cells not associated with the follicle, parafollicular cells. Those secrete calcitonin. Now, this is just a higher magnification of our thyroid gland, our parathyroid gland, okay? If you look at this and go back to our parathyroid gland here, you can see how if we zoom in on this, it would have an appearance that looks like this. But typically speaking, when you see a slide of parathyroid tissue, you'll see the thyroid gland associated with it as well. But this is parathyroid. And again, parathyroid gland is going to secrete parathyroid hormone, and that parathyroid hormone is going to have a significant effect on blood calcium levels. It's going to be something that we help to maintain those blood calcium levels. So again, on the thyroid gland, you should be able to identify it as thyroid gland, and you should be able to identify the follicles and follicular cells and the parafollicular cells and know what hormones are secreted from which, and the parathyroid, and that it secretes parathyroid hormone. All right, the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland, we said, is also called the suprarenal gland because it sits on top of the kidney. And it is divided into the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex, we said, was on the exterior of the adrenal gland, and the adrenal cortex is made up of 3 different zones. The outermost layer of the adrenal cortex is called the zona glomerulosa. The thicker middle portion is called the zona fasciculata, and the innermost portion is called the zona reticularis. These different zones are all going to secrete different types of hormones, which are going to have different effects in different parts of the body. The adrenal medulla is going to be the deepest part of the adrenal gland, and it is going to be innervated by sympathetic nervous control. That sympathetic nervous system is going to be responsible for the production of epinephrine and norepinephrine. All right. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to come from the adrenal medulla, and these different layers of the adrenal gland, the glomerulosa, the fasciculata, and the reticularis, they are going to be responsible for production of these different hormones. The zona glomerulosa, it's going to be responsible for production of aldosterone. The zona fasciculata, it's going to be responsible for the production of cortisol. And the zona reticularis, it's going to be responsible for the production of DHEA. Now, when we look at the adrenal gland, and I'm not crazy about this adrenal gland, I like this one a lot more because it gives us a really good representation of the three zones. When we look at the adrenal gland, on the outside of the adrenal gland, again, we said we had a capsule. Okay, that's going to be what's wrapping around the surface of the adrenal gland. Then we have our zona glomerulosa, which is this portion right here, right? It runs from right there to right there. So that's where we're going to produce aldosterone. Then we have our zona fasciculata, which is going to run from right here to right here. This is the thickest part. Okay, that's where we're going to produce cortisol. Then we have our zona reticularis, right here to right here, and that's going to be where we produce DHEA. And then the deepest part right here is our medulla. That's where we're going to produce norepinephrine and epinephrine. So make sure you can identify the capsule, the cortex, and the medulla, and then I'll be able to identify those three different zones and the medullary cavity. Don't worry about the capillary itself, just be able to do the adrenal medulla. And the pancreas. The pancreas is located inferior to the stomach. Like we said, the head of the pancreas is going to fit into the curved portion of the duodenum, which is the beginning part of the small intestine. That allows it to have exocrine function and secrete digestive enzymes into the intestinal system to begin the digestion process, which we will talk about when we get to the digestive system. But from an endocrine function, the endocrine function is primarily related to blood glucose levels. The two primary hormones associated with blood glucose levels are going to be glucagon and insulin. Glucagon is going to be responsible for raising blood glucose. Insulin is going to be responsible for lowering blood glucose. Alpha cells are going to secrete our glucagon, and beta cells are going to secrete our insulin. Now, we do have delta cells, which are going to secrete somatostatin, and we have F cells, which are going to secrete pancreatic peptide. That pancreatic peptide will be used in some digestive purposes. When we look at the pancreas, we're going to see two different types of tissue. We're going to see pancreatic acini. These are going to be the darker staining parts and make up the majority of the gland itself. And then we're going to see the Isles of Langerhans, okay, or the pancreatic islets. These are basically going to be lighter stained, almost kind of like they're faded parts of the pancreas. These faded clusters of cells are going to be what contains our beta cells, alpha cells, delta cells, and our F cells. Now, you're not going to have to identify the cells individually, but you will have to be able to identify the pancreatic islet compared to the pancreatic acini. So you'll need to be able to identify the pancreas as a whole and those two different structures. So when we look at the pancreas, okay, and on this one, it's a little less obvious to me at a lesser magnification. But out here, all of this would be the pancreatic acini. And then this faded portion right in the middle right here, that would be our pancreatic islet. All right, there's another pancreatic islet right there. okay? And all of this out here would be the acini. Now, to me, it's a little easier to see on this next slide, all right, because we're at a little higher magnification and this is stained a little bit better, I think. So all of this out here, pancreatic acini, and right there would be your pancreatic islet. Right there would be your pancreatic islet, all right? So to me, the pancreas is also another one of those tissues that is pretty easily recognizable, and it's because of these pancreatic islet. All right. Again, these tables, what I would do for these tables maybe is make some flashcards, all right? Make multiple sets of flashcards. Make yourself a set of flashcards that say, okay, these are the hormones. Where are these hormones released from? Hypothalamus. Where are these hormones released from? Anterior pituitary. Learn what hormone is associated with which gland. Then make yourself a set of flashcards maybe that have, okay, here's this hormone. What does it affect? And or what is its target tissue and what does it do? And then you can study it from that. Okay, but the first thing you need to do is know what comes from where. Then you can figure out what they affect and what they do. All right. Any questions?